In this video, we're going to talk about sampling. First, some definitions. It's important to understand what the population of interest is for your study. So this is going to be the set of observations that the study is intended to represent, or the people or units that you want to reach or make conclusions about. So that's your sort of ideal group that you are studying. The sampling frame is going to be the actual group that you're going to try to reach. So this is how we operationalize that population. That might include a list like a phone book or an email list that you have access to, or other ways of reaching your population. For example, if I'm trying to reach people in Utah County, I might go find people who are standing in line at the DMV, or at the grocery store or the gas station or something like that to try to reach people within my population. Or maybe I go to every fifth house and try to interview those households. So there are a variety of different ways that you would create a sampling frame, but the sampling frame is how you're going to actually represent the population. Mismatches between the sampling frame and the population can introduce bias. So for example, if I go to an expensive grocery store and I think that that's going to capture the majority of my population, I'm for sure going to be missing anyone who shops maybe at a discount grocery store, or populations that maybe don't shop at an ordinary grocery store, but maybe prefer places that have ethnic foods, that sort of thing. So that can introduce some really serious systematic bias and make it so that we're not actually representing the whole population that we're trying to make claims about. So we want to watch out for systematic differences between the sample and the population, by being careful about the sampling frame. Once we've identified a sampling frame, then we're going to choose our actual sample. So that's the subset of people that we are going to actively attempt to survey, observe, or measure. So the sampling frame is how we're going to identify those people. The sample is the people that we actually try to measure. If we use any method that's non-random, that's going to potentially introduce selection bias. Once we've chosen a sample though, and we've gone out and we've tried to reach people, so imagine our grocery store example, we've tried to talk to every fifth person in the grocery store line. Some of those people may actually decline to participate in the study. So in that case, the sample that had been chosen into our study doesn't actually match the respondents or observations who actually represented, in our study, who were actually represented, who participated in that study, and for whom we have information. So our respondents or observations are a subset of the sample. The sample is a subset of our sampling frame. The sampling frame representation of the population. Now, when we figure out how many people were in our sample and how many of them actually responded, that's going to be our response rate. And if there are a lot of people who didn't participate and we have a really low response rate, it's possible that we may have some bias in our study depending on why people chose not to participate. So that's one of the things we want to watch out for. But anytime people are choosing for themselves not to participate in the study, that's a self-selection bias, and we need to watch out for that as well. So here's a visual representation of what we just talked about. So this big box here is our population. So those are the folks that we're actually trying to make claims about. And you'll notice that our sampling frame doesn't perfectly match it. Like, we're trying to represent that population, but there's some people, these yellow stars over here, who are in our sampling frame but aren't actually in our population. That might be people like who are maybe registered voters in your area, and your sampling frame is a registered voter list. So they're registered in your area, but they've actually moved away. And then you also might have some people who are in the actual populations. These might be voters or citizens, for example, who've moved in and haven't yet registered to vote. So they are in your target population, but they're not in your sampling frame. So this rectangle down here represents our sampling frame. And there's some mismatch between that and the population. Now within that, we're going to choose a sample. In a moment, we'll talk about different methodologies for choosing a sample. And then the people who actually participate in our study, once they've been sampled, those are going to be our actual observations. So that little set of red stars are the observations actually in our study. And the ratio of observations to sample would be our response rate. So what we're trying to do is have as little bias in this whole system as possible. We want to make sure that we're actually targeting the right folks, that we're representing them well and fairly, that our sampling methodology doesn't overly bias, and that there's nothing in our recruitment methodology that biases people away from wanting to participate in this study. So let's talk about some approaches to sampling. These are the big ones. There are some sort of modifications of these. These are the big categories. A sample that includes all the units in the sampling frame is called a census. So if you're trying to reach everybody in your whole sampling frame, that's going to be a census sampling method. Doing a census is really expensive, and especially if you have non-respondents, it can create some bias if you don't have the resources to actually go after that full census, so be careful about that. If you randomize the sampling frame and then choose people into your sample randomly, that's called random sampling. And that's generally the standard for sampling, although there's a specialized version of that called a stratified random sample, where you organize that sampling frame into subgroups first. So maybe you want equal representation for men and women, for example. So you would divide up your list by men and women, and then you would randomly sample from both of those groups to make sure that you have equal representation. That would be called stratified random sampling. Another example of that would be if you are doing a sample of citizens of the state of Utah and you want equal representation from all of the counties or from urban and rural areas, then you might stratify based on county or urban versus rural, and then do random selection within those strata. So that's stratified random sampling. When you sample folks based on cost or convenience rather than randomness, that's called convenience sampling, and there are just a ton of different methodologies for convenience sampling. And then there's another one that I'm going to toss in here. It's not on the slide, but purposive sampling is where you go out and you intentionally sample certain people. So it's systematic, but it's not random and it's not stratified random. So those are a couple of different methodologies that you might use. And then finally, when you sample people by getting referrals from other people who are already in your sample, that's called snowball sampling. So for example, if I am trying to talk to BYU students who have eaten at the Cougar Eat, and that's the group of people that I want to talk to, I might start with a sample of people who were at the Cougar Eat on any given particular day, but I might ask them, hey, do you have any friends that weren't here today but that also eat at the Cougar Eat? And then we would gather their contact information from the person that was already sampled into our study, and in that way our sample could get bigger. So let's talk about when you would use these different methodologies, like when they make sense. You're going to want to use a census if you have the manual and technical capacity to actually gather and manage the quantity of data that you would need to do a census. Or if you have a small group that you're trying to gather information about, then a census would be appropriate because you can manage that data and you can manage what's necessary to actually go after each of those people and invite them to participate in your study. Random sampling is great because it's a statistically valid method for representing a very large population without needing to actually talk to that large population. So as long as you have a reasonably large random sample, typically that's going to be above 40 people, and beyond that it's going to depend on the precision that you want in your sample, then you can actually get something that looks really similar to the distribution of folks in your population, but without actually having to talk to all the people in the population. So that's one of the cool things about a random sample. Stratified random sampling is especially useful if you want to make sure that you are fairly representing views across meaningful boundaries, and especially if there are some underrepresented groups in that potential sampling that you might not get a good representation from if you did random sampling. Stratified random sampling allows you to oversample from certain groups, and then you can sort of scale back down their representation. But that way you're not sort of leaving to chance whether you have people in your sample who are underrepresented and have important views that you want to include. Convenience sampling is exactly what it sounds like. You would use convenience sampling when you need it to be fast and cheap and easy. Convenience sampling is perfect for things like pilot studies or exploratory studies where you just want to make sure that your instruments are working well, that you've refined your constructs well, and to see if there's really anything that there's any story to tell at all in a bigger, more expensive study. So convenience sampling has its place for sure. And then snowball sampling is especially useful when you're trying to build samples of people who have very rare characteristics or where those characteristics aren't easy to observe or to sample on. People tend to network, and especially if there's something about them that is rare or unique, they tend to find and network with other people who have that unique characteristic. So, snowball sampling can be really useful for identifying folks that you might not otherwise be able to find in order to get sort of critical mass for your study. So, I hope that this little review of sampling approaches and sampling methodology was useful, especially the visual on kind of what those different terms mean. And I appreciate your time and attention. Have a great day.